This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us, and welcome to the latest webinar that's jointly hosted by Wild Welfare and Global Animal Welfare. And we're really pleased to be joined by Dr Jake Veasey this evening. And Jake's a zoologist who did his training at University of London, and then a master's degree in applied animal behaviour and welfare science at Edinburgh University, before doing a doctorate in behavioural ecology at Glasgow University, or the University of Glasgow. And Jake's over 2 decades now. Jake's worked in some of the largest zoos and aquarium facilities in Europe and North America, and has award-winning designs in those facilities and other facilities as well. He's successfully integrated cutting-edge welfare science and practical experience into reimagining what good welfare looks like in zoos, aquariums and sanctuaries. And Jake's also a member of the IUCN for many years, and is active in situ conservation projects on 4 continents, and is particularly interested in the interface between conservation, animal welfare and public engagement. So Jake, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Simon, and thanks everyone for joining us. So there's a few things that I want to cover in this talk, and one of the key things is to encourage a degree of healthy skepticism towards best practice, because best practice is something that needs to continue to evolve, and often we can kind of look at husbandry guidelines as things that are set in stone. And really we need to sort of challenge them on a continual basis, and I'm going to hopefully give some examples of why that's particularly so. I also want to highlight the importance of understanding that there are a variety of different welfare conceptions out there, and how these impact not just how we go about delivering welfare, but also how animals experience welfare under our care. And then to provide you some information on a new tool that we've developed to help have a slightly different understanding of what good welfare might look like. And then to finish it off with providing some perhaps surprising findings of a facility-wide welfare audit that was based on this welfare identity priority system that I'm going to be talking about. So first of all, I've attended many conferences and many workshops and seminars such as this, where the theme is animal welfare. And I've sat through lots of talks and lots of presentations, and it's always been very clear to me that we're not always talking about the same thing. There are so many different conceptions of welfare, and I always start by discussing what welfare is, because there is no universal definition. Now, amongst the scientific community, welfare hedonism is the dominant view, and what we mean by that is that welfare is all about the feelings of animals. Now, physical well-being is relevant to welfare, but it's not relevant to welfare unless it impacts how animals feel. But amongst the stakeholders in the wild animal management sector, whether that's sanctuaries, welfare NGOs and zoos, only under a fifth of those stakeholders publicly subscribe to that scientific consensus of a hedonistic perception of welfare. So despite the scientific consensus around these hedonistic conceptions of welfare, it's not represented amongst welfare stakeholders in the wild animal welfare sector. And it's not necessarily reflected in how we manage animals either. So I'm going to start by providing my own definition of welfare. This is the definition that I subscribe to, and I'll just very quickly summarize this. So animal welfare relates to how animals feel. Good welfare occurs when animals experience positive emotional states such as happiness, enjoyment, pleasure, satiation, excitement, contentment, relaxation, comfort, etc., and negligible mental suffering. In contrast, poor animal welfare occurs when animals experience severe or chronic states of mental suffering, such as unhappiness, distress, depression, pain, anxiety, hunger, thirst, frustration, discomfort, and loneliness. So this definition doesn't exclude physical impacts, but it just recognizes they're only relevant to welfare when they impact how animals feel. So let's see how this compares with some of the key stakeholders in the certainly within the zoo management sector. Now, what I've done here is provided the definitions provided by these regional zoo associations, and I've highlighted those components that relate to physical well-being in red, and those that relate to the psychological well-being highlighted in green, just so you can get a feel for what's going on there. And you can see a fairly common trend is for organizations to define animal welfare by both physical and psychological components. And often the physical components come first. Now, at first, this might seem reasonable. In fact, it is reasonable. But without qualifying that these physical impacts are only relevant to welfare when they impinge on how animals feel, a very crude interpretation of these can and does have very problematic outcomes. And the reason behind that is because the physical aspects of welfare are both easier to quantify and deliver, they become the dominant and prevailing emphasis on welfare management, to the potential detriment of the animal's overall welfare. And to further reiterate this issue, if we look at the husbandry guidelines, so this is an assessment undertaken across 19 husbandry guidelines back in 2017 across AZA. I've used the same color coding there, so red relates to the content relating to physical well-being, and the green relates to psychological well-being. And of those 19 manuals, just 16% of the content related to the psychological components of care. And this bias, this emphasis towards physical well-being can have quite profound impacts upon the welfare of animals. I want to give quite a stark illustration of this. Now, both the US, the UK, Australia, and EU have all undertaken assessments on the welfare impacts of farrowing crates upon the welfare and well-being of sows in the agricultural sector. Now, the US and Australian assessments, the welfare impacts were deemed to be beneficial because their conceptions of welfare related to disease, injury, immunology, growth rates, etc. There was a very strong bias towards physical conceptions of well-being, whereas in contrast, the UK and EU assessments included considerations of the effective states of the sows, and therefore concluded they were detrimental to welfare. Now, this illustrates a couple of things. First, that there is an inherent tension between physical and psychological priorities in welfare management, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail just now, but also the importance of conceptions and how they impact both how we undertake delivering welfare, but also how animals experience it. So clearly we face choices in managing animals, and there is a spectrum of, there's a continuum of emphasis in how we approach the management of animal welfare, the extent to which we emphasize physical versus psychological. So I just want to now move on to looking at that in a bit more detail in relation to wild animals, and in this case amphibians, because they're relatively small and arguably a bit more simpler to provide for than some of the bigger mammalian species. So at one end of an animal management spectrum, we can have an intensive system such as this, where the animals are reliant upon direct human inputs. We have a lot of control over these environments that allow us to de-risk the environment for the animal, maximize their physical health and our ability to, in this case, protect them from chytrid fungus and monitor inputs, water quality, individual food consumption, and ultimately seeing how individual animals are doing, how much food they're consuming, and that capacity and ability to intervene as necessary. At the other end of that management spectrum is a more extensive management system, such as here in a classic kind of rainforest type environment, where the animals are more reliant upon typically bigger habitats that are arguably better suited to the psychological well-being of these animals, because they're more empowered to make species appropriate choices, but inevitably they are exposed to greater risks, and there is less oversight and capacity for keeping staff to intervene. And indeed, if any of the animals in this extensive environment, any of the amphibians in this environment were to become sick, it probably would never be detected, and the animal would effectively, potentially die and become compost before we even know that there's something going on. And of course, there's an intermediate across that spectrum where we can have some oversight and perhaps provide for the more obvious psychological priorities. And at the other end of this spectrum is obviously the wild, where the animal has evolved to be in that space, and therefore it meets its psychological needs, but inevitably it does face challenges to its physical well-being, which is why the vast majority of wild animals don't actually live long enough to reproduce. So in deciding how we position ourselves on this spectrum, I developed a conceptual relationship between the size, complexity, our ability to exert control, and how that relates to the physical and psychological health of animals to help us better understand our decision-making process. So, as we've seen, there's a spectrum of animal management ranging from an intensive form of management all the way through to the wild environment where there is effectively zero management. And our ability to provide those physical safeguards diminishes the more extensive the environment the animal has access to, up until the point that that animal is wild, where we have effectively no capacity to provide physical safeguards to those animals. And again, the more intense the environment, the greater the control, the greater the oversight, the greater our capacity to intervene. What conflicts with this are the differential psychological opportunities. The more complex environment, and complexity and size of habitats can be lazy welfare metrics. So when I refer to complexity, I'm not just referring to complexity for the sake of complexity, it's species appropriate complexity. So the nearer we get to the wild, the greater the psychological opportunities for that animal, because that is the environment that animal has evolved to be in. But there is this inevitable tension between these two. And it would be fantastic if animal welfare peaked at the intersection between these two metrics, but unfortunately, it's not that simple. And in addition to it not being that simple, we are faced with the differential capacity of our ability to measure the relative benefits of these factors, because it's easier to measure physical well-being, it's easier to measure longevity, lifespan, reproductive output, etc., than it is to measure happiness. And that tends to push those of us responsible for managing captive animals, towards a comfort zone, which is focusing on things that we can measure and things we can demonstrate and things we can prove, and ultimately things that we're good at, when in fact animal welfare is likely to peak as we release some of those physical safeguards and provide for greater psychological opportunities. And the reason this relationship isn't symmetrical is the challenges to physical well-being are typically short-lived. If an animal is sick, it'll either get better or it will die. Whereas if an animal is in an environment that does not meet its psychological needs, the impacts of that are potentially lifelong. So, but in order to reach this point of peak welfare, this optimal welfare point, we don't need to replicate everything an animal experiences in the wild, because not everything an animal experiences in the wild is necessarily good for its welfare. And if we replicated everything that occurred in the wild, by definition, it's an inevitability that we would give up on some of those physical safeguards. So in order to get us closer and closer to this point of peak welfare, we need to understand the relative importance of the natural opportunities that animals encounter to the welfare. And that's essentially what led to the development of the Animal Welfare Priority Identification System, or ORPIS, as its acronym, which helps us identify what these priorities are. Now, why do we need ORPIS? We have a good understanding of the physical health of animals, and we have existing best practice. But as I hope you're gonna hopefully come away from this talk understanding, those priorities often reflect this measurability. They're skewed towards what's easier to measure and not necessarily what has the greatest impact on welfare. And they also often don't reflect, as a result of that, these hedonistic definitions of welfare. We're also typically far better at providing for an animal's physical well-being than we are for their psychological well-being. And I think this photograph illustrates that point. Here we have a very long-lived polar bear, far older than the average polar bear would get to live in the wild, but clearly this environment doesn't really necessarily meet the psychological needs of this species. And so what ORPIS does is it helps us rebalance that relationship and hopefully achieve higher standards of welfare. Also, in terms of improving welfare based on evidence, we are very reliant upon comparative welfare studies. We do before and after assessments, and we compare animals in different environments. And not only is welfare difficult to measure, it's very difficult to identify causality. And when we're comparing different captive environments, inevitably, many important aspects of the wild that no captive animal has the opportunity to express can get missed, such as migration and roaming and hunting. All of these potentially important opportunities are absent from those comparative welfare assessments. Also, the best we can possibly achieve from comparative studies are relative assessments. We might assume one environment is better at providing for welfare than another, but that baseline may be low. And it's that low baseline that may also overinflate and provide us a more optimistic view of enrichment, which is another, enrichment studies are another form of comparative study where we're not necessarily comparing two different habitats, but we're often comparing a before and after. And there's an assumption that if an animal continues to interact with a device, which simply by having that time interacting with that device, it reduces opportunities for other behaviors, that inevitably indicates poor welfare. But what it may also indicate, as I hope this picture helps illustrate is it may simply reflect a low baseline of well-being. These kids clearly enjoying playing with this broken TV set. That's not a measure of how effective a broken TV set is improving human well-being. It's a great reflection of the relative well-being of these two young lads. And finally, ultimately, it's there to provide more effective animal-centered performance criteria for both design and management. And I pick up these just two pictures, again, new orangutan facility, optimized for public viewing rather than the behavioral ecology of the species. And there's a whole kind of movement related to apps for apes and other animals. And yes, indeed, these animals may interact with iPads, but it's not necessarily reflective of the route to achieve optimal welfare. So this is a very quick summary of how orpis works, how this process worked. And it's essentially based on a relationship between evolution, motivation, and animal welfare. Now, behaviors and cognitive processes that are of high evolutionary significance, the way evolution makes these important behaviors and mental process become manifest is making them highly motivated for. And so there's a relationship between the evolutionary significance of behaviors and cognitive processes and the strength of the motivation. Now, if those behaviors and cognitive processes are frustrated as a result of being in a captive environment, the impact on welfare is proportional to the amount of to the strength and frequency of the motivation, which in turn links back to the welfare significance. Now, we correct for this by understanding where the motivation comes from, and we'll touch on that in the next slide, because we can have highly motivated behaviors that are not necessarily welfare priorities if the stimulus for those behaviors can be safely removed from captive environments, and we'll touch on that in the next slide. So essentially we get a panel of experts together and they assess every single behavior and cognitive process according to 14 criteria, and this data is then consolidated with a series of algorithms that places a value on every behavior and cognitive process, which allows us to determine a relative value of these naturally occurring behaviors and opportunities. And it does only consider behaviors and cognitive opportunities that animals experience in nature. It definitely doesn't look to attempt to assess the value of playing with iPads, for example. So to give you a very quick example of how this is undertaken, imagine you're this blue fish, or you're managing this blue fish, and we're trying to decide whether or not providing this animal opportunities to acquire food versus opportunities for this animal to escape being food, in terms of its the relative, what priority should we give that in terms of safeguarding their welfare. Both of these behaviors are of high survival value. Both of them, when they are motivated for, will be highly motivated for. They're both likely to be energy intensive. Again, all of these are suggestive that these are high evolutionary significance. And now we start seeing a dichotomy in these behaviors. Acquiring food is going to be typically a longer duration than escaping being food. And again, I'm not talking about predator avoidance, I'm talking about predator evasion. So these are relatively short-lived and rare events. And so acquiring food, by contrast, is regular and frequent. The need to acquire food comes from within the animal. We can't simply eliminate that motivation to go out looking for food by putting it in a captive environment, but a captive environment in which that animal never perceives a predator, that behavior, that motivation will never need occur. And therefore, we should be more comfortable about its relative importance in terms of captive prioritization. So The motivational triggers of acquiring food are likely to persist in captivity, and in fact, we should be seeking to eliminate the motivational triggers of escaping being eaten in captivity. Lack of opportunities linked to the acquisition of food can result in stereotypes in a number of species, whereas lack of opportunities to avoid escaping predators, and again, rather than predator avoidance, predator evasion, those lack of opportunities are arguably symbolic of enhanced welfare. And as a result, for this bluefish, acquiring food is far more likely to be a need than escaping being food. And again, this is a very simplistic analysis. It's a very simplified version of the entire process. The last one we undertook had, like I say, 35 experts from around the world. We provided 16,000 data points to assess the behavior of these animals. This is a very quick and dirty illustration. But what it shows is that not all normal natural behaviors are equally important. And it's worth understanding that both the 5 freedoms and the 5 domain models refer to normal natural behaviors, whereas what orpis does is enable us to actually distinguish between those that are more important than others. Now, we've undertaken a number of these assessments, each of which are providing new insights into the needs of species and ultimately, what best practice might look like. Here we've got 2 different assessments for the same species. We've got in situ experts versus ex situ experts. And what the point of this correlation is to show, despite these differing backgrounds, there's good agreement between the output of the different cohorts. And I've outlined there those behaviors and cognitive processes that are likely to be the ones that we should be emphasizing in terms of providing optimal welfare. Now, some of these behaviors are essential for survival, such as sleeping, eating, and drinking, and arguably we could say captivity provides for those. But what we're learning from these assessments, and indeed they don't set out to seek to understand their impact upon survival, they seek to understand their impact upon the psychological well-being of animals. So despite the fact that captivity can tick the box that we provide opportunities for tigers to sleep, eat, and drink, what this encourages us to do is to relook at these, because they likely need greater attention than merely ticking that box. And I'm going to give you an example of exactly how we need to give more attention to how we feed tigers, for example, as a result of these assessments and in comparison to existing paradigms with regards to best practice. So again, it's widely accepted that health is a foundation of good welfare, and nutrition is a foundation of good health. And so the conclusion that the American Association of Zoo Veterinarians comes to, that whenever possible we should use species-specific commercially prepared diets should be utilized for the basis of any nutritional program. Again, there's a very clear logical chain of events. Absolutely, physical well-being links back to welfare. Physical well-being is dependent upon good nutrition, and the most effective way to safeguard nutrition is to provide for these commercially prepared, highly processed diets where we know the exact macronutrients and mineral balance, etc. So there's a very rational chain of logic to this recommendation encouraging commercially prepared diets. But let's just briefly look at the impact on this on tiger welfare in light of this most recent orpis assessment that we undertook for the species. So in the wild, acquiring food is about so much more than hunting. There's a whole maintenance phase associated with maintaining a territory. A tiger doesn't get to hunt unless it has a territory in which it can hunt. And to understand the size of that territory, it needs to understand prey density and distribution. It needs to protect that territory from competitors. It needs to ensure there are, mates within that territory, and to monitor the status of all those individuals. And then over and above maintaining that territory, there's a prolonged appetitive phase linked to locating the prey, monitoring the prey's movement, understanding where the prey is likely to be at certain amounts of time, followed by stalking, chasing, killing, consumption, and a very important post-consummatory phase. And this is, and again, we picked up the food and rest are important, and this is where these two are intrinsically linked. In the wild, a tiger will eat up to 20% of its body mass in any single meal, and the minute it does that, the minute it's consumed that volume of food, it distends the stomach, and it's that stomach stretching that actually shuts down the motivation to go out there and look for further hunting opportunities. In contrast, in the captive environment, where we come at it from the starting point that we need to provide optimal nutrition, certainly within North America, this emphasis on maintaining physical well-being through nutritional management dictates the nature of the food being given. And so this processed chows are routinely given to captive carnivores, and we make up with this with various enrichment related activities, typically involving training or mimicking hunting behaviors. And lo and behold, we still have tigers that pace, show anticipatory pacing behaviors, and just general all-pervasive pacing behaviors, to the extent that we actually design around those pacing behaviors with overhead walkways that arguably make pacing an attraction for the visitors. But when we look at the relative orpis scores for each of these components of this suite of behaviors linked to the acquisition of food, we can see that the focus of enrichment on, olfactory stimulation, where we put smelly socks and all sorts of stuff in tiger enclosures to get them to sniff stuff around, and we replicate a lot of the hunting behaviors, are actually the focus of enrichment on captive tiger well-being does not reflect the actual priorities as determined by orpis. And it's these priorities that are linked to travel, to territory maintenance, ultimately information gathering, that are more important than hunting. And actually, when you think about it, it becomes quite obvious. Tigers have a flexible relationship with hunting. They can scavenge, they can steal food, and they can be fed big meals in captive environments. And that essentially shuts down that motivation to forage. Whereas maintaining a territory is essential for acquiring food, whether that be through stealing, scavenging, or hunting, but it's also essentially for maintaining reproductive opportunities, other assets necessary for survival, such as water, and tigers spend up significantly more time and energy maintaining these territories and all of the behaviors associated with that. And if we consider the stereotypes expressed by tigers in captive environments are more closely linked to these territory maintenance behaviors, this patrolling the territory has far more similarities to pacing than any hunting behavior is likelihood. It becomes increasingly obvious that we've been putting a lot of effort in the wrong areas, which is why enriched tigers that receive processed daily diets can still indeed pace as much as tigers travel in the wild. And so each of these assessments that we've undertaken, as I hope this one illustrates, that there are flaws in existing priorities And which is why it's so important to reflect on best practice. And the same is true for polar bears. Again, these are the behaviors for polar bears. This diagram just illustrates that regardless of the expert discipline background, whether it's in situ specialist, whether it's ex situ specialist, whether it's welfare scientists, there's a good degree of agreement in what are the priorities for each of the species, with each one of these blue dots reflecting a specific behavior or cognitive process. And again, this is a summary of the output for polar bears. And I've color coded these with the red color to be the physiological necessities related to feeding, drinking, and sleeping. The yellows are behaviors with a significant cognitive element. Blues are behaviors with a limited cognitive element, and greens are predominantly cognitive aspects. And again, we see, similarly as we did with tigers and as we've seen with other species, the physiological necessities are also psychological priorities and need more attention. So with polar bears, we need a greater attention to denning opportunities, post-carcass resting, which we'll come on to. And again, drinking, really obvious one, but actually when you think about it, a wild polar bear never gets to, or very rarely gets to, drink fresh water. They're surrounded by, they live in a marine ecosystem in which the ocean is obviously saline. The temperatures are such that there's never any virtually never any standing fresh water. And so they get their hydration from them metabolizing fat, or drinking or consuming snow and ice, which is very energy intensive, and yet that's how they function in nature, and it's certainly not how they're managed in captivity, and we don't know the impacts of that. But what this does is at least encourages us to have a think about that. But pivoting back to diet, what's also clear is, much like tigers, polar bears need a higher fat level than they're currently being given, and they need fewer, bigger meals. Because one of the things that we showed, because we've undertaken assessments, we undertook one of the very earliest assessments using this methodology for Asiatic black bears many years ago now, and we're able to correlate those behaviors that overlap between these species to see the similarities. And what this graph shows is that there's a significant similarity between the behaviors of Siberian tigers and polar bears, and not between Asiatic black bears and bears. And so it's worth acknowledging the husbandry standards. Certainly in Europe, there are guidelines for bears in general, and not all bears are the same. And whilst it may be tempting to generalize across species, interestingly, polar bears probably have far more in common in terms of their management needs with tigers than they do with other bear species. And when we look at the breakdown of their diet, it becomes very obvious. And you might be led to believe that we're not pointing out anything that's not new here. And yet, when we look at the dietary management of polar bears in terms of best practice guidelines, it's certainly not represented in how the species are managed. In the wild, they eat these large, high-fat meals on a relatively infrequent basis, maybe a couple of times a week. Whereas the maximum amount of meat they're recommended to have on the bone in certainly the ASA guidelines is currently 7%, and whole prey should make up no more than 2.5%, and whole prey is deemed to be large rats and rabbits. So again, it's just interesting that the the best practice standards seem to bear no relationship to the behavioral ecology of the species in the wild, and certainly not what we're identifying once we undertake these assessments. And in fact, recent recommendations into dietary management of polar bears is recognizing they're not getting enough fat, something that orpis certainly pointed us in the direction of. But it's interesting the solution that is being proposed, and that is a high fat kibble processed diet. Again, not really looking at the solution in terms of the holistic impact. It's not just about macronutrients, it's about integrating the nutritional needs of animals into a more holistic framework that the orpis enables us to do. One of the other, very quickly go through this, one of the things that we undertook in the this polar bear assessment was trying to identify the extent to which the priorities were provided for in the captive environments. And we can see there's actually a relationship between the importance of behaviors and the extent to which captivity appears to provide for them, which suggests that we are heading in the right direction. But I want to caveat this with, this is a very simple risk matrix in that we asked the experts whether or not polar bears had opportunity for sleeping, walking, or eating animals, for example. What we didn't do is assess the quality of those opportunities. And so we will be looking at that, refining that in future assessments. Lastly, very quickly, talk you through the assessment we did on elephants. Again, pointing out the these behaviors linked to travel. And indeed, the emerging theme of all of these assessments that we've undertaken is that outside of those behaviors and cognitive processes that are necessary for survival, for physiological, they're a physiological necessity, walking or travel is the highest non-physiological necessity. And it's the same for all of those, all of the species assessed so far. And again, the bottom bar was assessed by those responsible for elephants in captivity. The cohort to the left was assessed by ex situ specialists at a conference hosted by Animals Asia. And again, it's just worth highlighting this outlier. The guys who worked with elephants in captivity ranked processing food as very high because that's how we make up for the lack of foraging opportunities. We require them to work for food in a different way, but it doesn't necessarily reflect their needs derived from their behavior in the wild. So again, this is just summarizing that data in a different way. And just to point out what this is pointing out, for example, is that whilst all husbandry guidelines state that having access to a pool is mandatory, bathing and swimming are relatively low priorities for Asian elephants, and for those of us who've been responsible for managing them, you certainly know that they don't use them that often, and bizarrely only seem to use them when it's raining, etc. And this isn't to say we shouldn't provide elephants with pools, but when we're spending millions of dollars or millions of pounds or euros or whatever investing in the well-being of elephants, we might be better off providing a nice decent mud a mud pool for them to go in occasionally and spend those many millions of pounds that would have been spent on a filtered pool on other areas of enrichment. And again, none of the husbandry guidelines state foraging and feeding duration are related priorities, which certainly emerge as greater priorities. One of the things that's coming out from these assessments is this recurring theme of movement, and it's movement linked to a suite of connected behaviors rather than looking at movement in isolation, because interestingly, tigers, even elephants, often travel as far in a zoo as they do in the wild. It's the lack of purpose, it's the lack of choice, it's the lack of behaviors linked to that movement that I think are really key. So we've coined this phrase meaningful locomotion, and that's the opportunity of animals to undertake journeys to from biologically appropriate places, circumstances, and opportunities of their choosing comparable to those made in the wild. So we're in the middle of undertaking a major initiative for this, to provide meaningful opportunities for captive tigers, working with a major international animal welfare NGO. And we hope to start work on that with regards to elephants later in 2023 as well. And Simon, I don't know how much time I've got left, because there is now a bit of a natural break, but I can rattle through.
Yeah, I mean, how much more time do you need?
I'll go through it as very quick as I can. As quick as I can. So we've seen that this allows us, this technique allows us to kind of identify welfare priorities, but they in turn can help us undertake welfare assessments. And one of the things to understand when we're assessing welfare is we're not actually assessing welfare. We're assessing things that can impact welfare, they're welfare inputs, and we're assessing things that are indicative of a welfare state. Because welfare is what animals feel and they can't tell us what we feel, we have to assess welfare indirectly. And again, what orpis does is it focuses on these welfare inputs by identifying those behaviors and cognitive opportunities that are important to welfare. So we undertook a facility-wide welfare audit, a major North American wildlife attraction, and we undertook 3 different assessments of welfare: a holistic welfare assessment where staff were trained to kind of do these very quick analysis on what's important to animals and provided guidance on how to quantify that. We looked at metrics of physiological challenges of these animals in the environments they're in, the appropriateness of the social circumstances, the locomotor opportunities, the extent to which, for example, animals could run, fly, swim, or whatever at maximal velocity within their habitat, how long they could do that for, if indeed they could do that, and the extent to which animals expressed abnormal behaviors. The veterinary team were self-selected their own criteria, looking at ease of emergency care, ease of preventative care, and morbidity and mortality. And we asked the visitors perceptions of happiness, health, and also their enjoyment of those facilities. And we undertook a whole bunch of safeguards to ensure that the data coming in from visitors was meaningful. They had to get a number of questions right before we considered their estimates of welfare. And these figures, this microscope to the binoculars all the way through to the satellite, is just to show that we can look at the same questions and the same issues through different lenses. If we want to understand an elephant, we could look at it under a microscope, or certainly bits of it, or its blood, to understand its physiology. But equally, we might want to look at its behavior at a watering hole interacting with conspecifics, but we might also want to track its movement via a satellite. And I think that the same is absolutely true of welfare. By taking a step back, as we did with this assessment, where we weren't assessing individual animal welfare, because this is a facility with over 50,000 animals in 130 plus habitats, we didn't want to attempt to assess individual well-being. We wanted to get this high-level kind of overview of performance across the entire habitat, the entire facility. And this is one of the most interesting results, is that there was this inverse relationship between the indices identified by the veterinary team as indicative of good welfare across habitats. There was an inverse relationship between that and that holistic welfare index. Each one of these little circles relates to an individual habitat. And, there were 9 keeping staff and half a dozen vets providing data to each one of those points. I certainly didn't provide any of that data. I just provided the guidance and the framework with which this data was collected. But this confirms this conceptual model illustrating that I developed 5 years prior to this to show that there is this tension between physical and psychological priorities. And this is an example of that manifest across a facility. This is the relationship between the holistic welfare index, which includes these orpis related priorities, but a whole bunch of other priorities, and visitor perceptions of welfare, levels of happiness of the animals, and indeed their enjoyment of those facilities. So the holistic welfare index was a good predictor of visitor enjoyment, visitors' perception of welfare, and also visitors' perception of happiness of those animals. Here is looking at stereotypes as indicators of poor welfare. Stereotypes, they have to come with caveats. Stereotyping can help animals cope, and stereotypes can be learned so they can persist beyond the problem. But despite all of those caveats, there was this strong relationship between the predisposition of animals to abnormal behaviors and their behavioral opportunities, the physiological challenges that they might experience, the social circumstances, and locomotor opportunities, which again confirm that they are a good high level indicator, certainly when you're looking at it this far back. And again, this is looking at visitor perceptions of the visitor welfare index, which is a combination of their assessment of happiness and health, correlated with the social environment animals were provided, the extent to which animals expressed abnormal behaviors, and the extent to which they had behavioral freedoms. And finally, this is visitor perceptions of animal happiness and their enjoyment. And what's clear from this is that, and again, this is something I encourage people to take back to institutions, is that animal welfare is as important to the it's not as important, it's infinitely more important to your animals, but it's also important to the visitor experience as well. It's not a cost to an institution, it's a moral obligation, but it's a very much a kind of a strategic priority. I'm running out of time, so I've had to rattle through that very quickly, but just to kind of summarize, I'd encourage you always to question the status quo and prevailing best practice. It's the only way by which we continue to deliver improvements in animal care and animal welfare. Be mindful of how your institution, or indeed you, conceive animal welfare, and also recognize that conceptions might not be the same across your organization and across your stakeholders. And this needs to be really balanced when, for example, designing habitats. A habitat in which there's been very much led by an emphasis on delivering physical health is going to be very different from one that's emphasizing psychological well-being. And again, encourage you to consider more hedonistic conceptions of welfare when you go about managing your animals. Use tools like orpis. Again, orpis it's a big undertaking to do each assessment. On average, they're taking about a year to complete, identifying the experts and convening the workshop all the way through to analyzing and writing them up. So they're a big lengthy thing to undertake, but just start thinking about the importance of these behaviors to an animal's evolutionary characteristics, and also the origin of the motivation when kind of trying to consider what's important for welfare. Again, also remember the public here to have a far better understanding of welfare than we've given them credit for, and ultimately, certainly for zoos, investing in the happiness of animals. Again, it's not just a cost; it's a strategic imperative. It really matters, and that's it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jake. That's as always, fantastic presentation and a lot of food for thought there. So hopefully everyone's found that really interesting. We got some questions. Did you want to take the questions, Nick, or
yeah,
is your internet stable?
For now it is, yeah. So there's just one more of a general one, just talking about how amazing the talk has been. So thank you, Jake. And the more we know about animals, the less they should be kept in captivity. They're eager to learn more about orpis. So if people are eager to learn more about the assessment, we can obviously put them in touch with you, and I assume you're happy to take.
Yeah, I mean,
inquiries.
If they go to the website carefortherare.com, there's a page of publications, and all of the orpis assessments we've completed are available online there. The most recent one for polar bears, which we're hoping to produce these in a welfare priority series that we want to make freely available. The first one of which is the polar bear assessment. It's available on Amazon, so you can search for that on Amazon, and we're gonna rewrite the elephant and the tiger assessments in the same format. The one that we did with you, Nick, on Asiatic black bears was a little bit too primitive and experimental at that stage. We're due to undertake one for orangutans early next year, and we'll get that available in due course.
Fab, fantastic. So another question: in the US, there is no regulating body for reptile and amphibian welfare. New research about the requirements and best husbandry practices are constantly changing in the field, with some still not accepting that reptiles can even feel pain. How can orpis help in reptile management when views of welfare are so divided, and providing accurate assessments seem to come down to differences in opinion in both psychological and physical welfare? Good question.
Well, I mean, anyone who kind of questions whether a reptile, a fish, or whatever can feel pain, I think you're going to be hard pressed to persuade them of anything. But certainly, what orpis does is it provides a basis with which, you know, by and large, with most species, and it's not always true for animals we keep in captivity, but typically most animals we keep in captivity, we can keep alive longer than they typically do in nature. So we have on the whole, a far greater understanding of the physical needs of animals than we do the psychological needs. And that's not to say there aren't gaps with physical needs, there certainly are, but wherever there are gaps in physical needs, the gaps in psychological needs are even greater. What orpis does is it provides a counterpoint to balance those needs. So when you've got nutritionists saying, well, listen, you know, we need this kind of diet, therefore this is the most effective way of providing that. What orpis does is saying, well, that's great, but the behaviors linked to the acquisition of food are really, really important. So how can we bring these two together in a far more kind of holistic way of achieving that? And certainly, I think, again, I can't really speak to the regulation of reptile welfare. I mean, I think it, you know, that almost sounds like an issue of politics rather than it does management, because I know there's 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 state law, there's federal law, etc. And I think one of the things that I'm constantly asked, and was asked many times following the polar bear assessment, is how big does my polar bear habitat need to be? And I think that is the way best practice and guidelines are structured. You need to give X amount of square meters, and the temperature needs to be this, and all of that. The way I think we need to think about best practice is we need to achieve outcomes, and the overall outcome is good welfare. But what is it that is required to achieve good welfare? And for example, if meaningful movement is important to the welfare of polar bears, simply stating a facility of X square meters is not necessarily going to achieve that unless it's got reasons to travel in that landscape in a structured way. So it's, as we get more nuanced in our understanding of welfare and how we prioritize it, unfortunately, I think husbandry guidelines are potentially going to become a little bit less prescriptive in terms of size, temperatures, and all of these things, because I don't think that is necessarily the right approach. And it comes back to this meaningful rather than measurable. We emphasize on things that are tangible and measurable, but that's not really where the greatest gains in welfare are going to be achieved. So big spaces might not be as good as more species appropriate, moderately smaller spaces. Don't get me wrong, big spaces are always better if they're of equal quality, but quality matters as well, and that's where the nuance starts coming into it.
Oh, thank you. Another question here, which I think kind of plays into the whole you just mentioned about things getting political. How can caretakers, it'd be interesting to hear what you think, given your experience from North America and a European perspective, how can caretakers be empowered to question the status quo of welfare when the zoo industry is controlled mainly by stakeholders and CEOs largely removed from the daily caregiving and observation of behaviour?
Well, yeah, and the loudest voice in the zoo is not necessarily the one that has the most insights. Certainly that is the goal of these orpis documents, is to provide people with a tool that they can challenge the status quo. Which is one of the reasons they're challenging to do, because everyone's a little bit nervous about being involved in them because it might make their facility obsolete. And that's one of the challenges we've got. But one of the really reassuring things about this is, regardless of your background, whether you're for zoo or whether you're anti-zoo or whether you work in the wild, everyone is in complete agreement with the output. Everyone's always surprised. It's then what happens with that. And we deliberately put these out there as an informational document. We don't claim that they should be mandatory. We hope that it's up to regional zoo associations and indeed facilities to use these documents to guide their management, which is why we're keen to have as many of these as possible, to empower people in zoos to have that background material to sort of challenge the status quo. If there are particular issues that people are concerned about, like I say, we are keen to do as many of these assessments as we can. We want there to be a library of these assessments available. I'm happy to look about how we can make that happen. But failing that, it's apply those principles. What is the evolutionary significance? What are the signals that things might be important to animals? It's the origin of the stimulus. It's the percentage of animals in the wild that undertake that behavior. It's the amount of time they spend on this behavior. It's the amount of energy. There are a whole bunch of indicators that provide us insights that these behaviors might be important, and just build up that picture to make that case. And give me a shout, and I'll see if I can help.
Amazing.
Thanks.
Sorry, Nick. I was just going to say there's still quite a lot of questions, but they're very much in the same vein about wanting to know more about orpis. So unfortunately we've run out of time. But please reach out, search for Care for the Rare, and reach out to Jake that way to put your questions to him and find out more about orpis and how you can get involved and how you might commission one of these assessments on a species or a group of animals. Or so yeah. If you're struggling to find Jake, please reach out to Wild Welfare or Global Animal Welfare, and we'll put you in touch. So yeah, I don't know if you've got anything else to add, Nick, before we.
No, just to say massive thanks to you, Jake. I think it's thought-provoking for anyone involved in captive wildlife care, whether it's zoos or sanctuaries, rescue centres, etc. I think it will give everybody something to think about, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's more questions once everyone's gone away and processed all of that information as well.
A couple of little just quick takeaways from me is one of the challenges with orpis is it's actually quite a complicated process to undertake, and to maintain one of the things we didn't want to happen is for people to go away and attempt to do it, but not truly understand the nuance involved and come out with different results for the same. We want to maintain the quality. So our approach to delivering orpis is to control the assessment in that we facilitate it, but to make the output freely available. That's just one thing to be aware of, but that doesn't stop anyone doing these kind of more sort of anecdotal ones within your own organization. And the other thing is, like I say, the big thing that is emerging, and I think is going to become a big frontier in animal welfare in the coming decade, at least I hope so, is this issue of meaningful movement. And that because movement is the behavioral and cognitive glue that links all behaviors. Animals move to and from resources, opportunities. It's the thing that connects everything, and it's the thing that we've always assumed we just can't replicate in captivity because of the constraints on space. And yet animals pace, they travel as far as the zoo as they do in nature. The difference are the mental and opportunities linked to that, and how they knit together. So we are undertaking this major undertaking with tigers as we speak. We're hoping that proof of concept is going to be delivered in 2023. And I hope if we're successful in delivering that for tigers, that's going to cascade down to arguably every captive animal because travel is so important to every captive animal, but certainly every wide-ranging animal. And we're hoping to do that with elephants as well next year. So watch this space. It could be a really interesting time. And I think there is, potentially a new animal welfare frontier emerging there.
Amazing. Yeah, that's a real key takeaway from and a good way to end the webinar. So thank you very much, Jake. And yeah, thank you very much for everyone for joining us. And we will let you know when the next webinar is very soon.
Thanks, Jake.
Thanks, guys.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.